It all began on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky sits a little too still and the wind seems to be holding its breath. The phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. On the other end was a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Carter. Her voice was smooth, polite, and carried the kind of calm confidence that suggested she was used to giving instructions and having them followed. She explained that she needed someone to watch over her dog for a few days while she traveled out of town. The job would last 3 days, and she assured that it was simple. Just feeding the dog, taking him for a walk once a day, and keeping an eye on the house. Her offer came with a payment that was surprisingly generous, almost too generous for such a short and easy job. But what caught attention the most was what she said at the end of the call. She added in a softer tone that there was only one rule: do not enter the basement. It was said so casually, as if it was nothing serious. She claimed it was full of old junk and some broken furniture, and she didn't want anyone getting hurt or messing with anything down there. Her laughter followed the warning, light but with a hint of something else, something that didn't quite sit right. The call ended with a time and an address. The house stood alone at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to lean a little too close. It looked old but well kept, with wide windows and thick wooden doors. The front garden was neat, but not freshly cared for, like it had once been loved but was now just left to maintain itself. The dog, Charlie, was waiting by the door when the visitor arrived. He was a large black Labrador, friendly-looking but oddly quiet. He didn't bark or jump, just stared up with deep, unreadable eyes, and then turned to walk back inside. The house had that heavy silence that old places sometimes carry, as though every wall remembered something. Inside, everything smelled faintly of old wood and lavender. The guest room was neat, the kitchen well-stocked, and the schedule for Charlie written clearly on a yellow notepad by the fridge. The instructions were simple: feed him at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., take him for a short walk before dark, and never, under any circumstances, go into the basement. That warning echoed again, this time written in large capital letters at the bottom of the note. The first night passed without much trouble. Dinner was cooked, Charlie ate without fuss, and the house grew quiet under the weight of the night. But just after midnight, as the world outside fell into a deep stillness, something stirred. A scratching sound crept through the silence, slow, steady, and wrong. It didn't come from Charlie. It came from the walls. The road leading to Mrs. Carter's house was long, quiet, and wrapped in the kind of silence that made even the birds hesitate to sing. The property stood alone, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in slightly the closer one got. The house itself looked straight out of an old photograph, tall, with dark wooden walls, steep roofing, and windows that reflected nothing but stillness. It was the kind of place that looked untouched by time, almost forgotten by the world. As the front door creaked open, the smell of age hit immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, just thick, like dust and old books mixed with something sweeter. Lavender, maybe, or dried roses. Charlie, the dog, stood patiently in the hallway, his black coat shining under the faint light. He didn't bark or wag his tail too hard. He simply watched, blinking slowly, as if judging silently. There was something calm about him, but also something unnervingly quiet. The interior of the house was large and shadowy, with high ceilings and walls decorated with faded paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The floors were old wood, each step producing soft creaks that echoed through the silence. The first day passed without event. Charlie followed around quietly, ate his meals, and went on his walk with little trouble. He never pulled the leash, never ran, just walked slowly, like he was always thinking. As the evening came and the sun disappeared behind the trees, the shadows inside the house grew darker. The lights flickered once or twice, but no more than what might be expected from an old house. The guest room was upstairs, neat and simple, with a window that overlooked the overgrown backyard. At exactly 2 in the morning, something changed. Sleep broke suddenly, not from a dream, but from a sound. Soft at first, but steady. A scratching noise. Not fast or loud. Just a slow, dragging scratch, like something dull scraping against wood. At first, it seemed to come from the walls, then from below the floorboards. Rising quietly, the sound grew clearer, more deliberate. Charlie, who had been sleeping beside the bed, raised his head slowly. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared toward the bedroom door, ears perked, body stiff. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the entire house had paused to listen. The hallway beyond the room remained dark, shadows sitting like still figures. The lights didn't flicker again, but the air inside had shifted. Thicker, colder, like the house had taken a breath and was now waiting. Charlie lay back down, but his eyes never closed. He watched the door until morning, as though guarding it. Downstairs, in some corner not yet explored, something had made its presence known, and whatever it was, it had only just started. The morning light didn't feel as comforting as it should have. The house, despite its size and beauty, had begun to feel like it was hiding something it wasn't willing to show. The silence of the previous night still hung in the air, thick and uneasy. After breakfast, when Charlie was fed and let out for his walk, the unease grew. As the sun climbed higher, the house felt colder, even though the temperature outside was mild. The strange scratching noise from the night before lingered in the back of the mind, but there was something more pressing now. A door. At the end of the long hallway, hidden behind a dark, heavy curtain, there was a door that hadn't been mentioned in Mrs. Carter's instructions. It stood out of place, newer than everything around it, and its locks gleamed strangely, as if they had been recently polished. There was no indication of what lay beyond it, no handles like the others, just a solid, unremarkable surface. The door was locked, though, with not one, not two, but 3 sturdy locks, all fastened tight. It was almost as if someone had wanted to make sure it remained undisturbed. Charlie, who had been following around quietly, suddenly stopped just in front of the door. His movements became stiff, his head tilting slowly as if he were listening to something. His tail stopped wagging, and a low, barely audible growl bubbled up from deep within his chest. For a moment, everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the door. It was the way the house seemed to hold its breath, the way the air felt thick, as though the walls themselves were watching. The door, though nothing special to look at, seemed to demand attention. There was something about it that felt off, as though it was keeping a secret, something the house didn't want to let go of. The curiosity was unbearable. Carefully, a hand reached out toward the door. There was no sound, nothing to warn of the danger lying in wait. Only the cold, unsettling quiet of the house pressing in. The growl from Charlie grew a little louder, but still, the door remained closed, unmoving. Whatever was behind it, whatever caused Charlie's unease, was beyond reach for now. That night, the scratching returned, louder, sharper, more frantic. But this time, the noise didn't just come from the walls. It came from behind the door, from somewhere deep inside the house. The sound of nails scraping against wood, a slow, deliberate drag, as though something or someone was desperately trying to escape. It went on for what felt like hours, and every minute of it scraped at the nerves. Charlie, lying quietly beside the bed, continued to growl softly, his eyes locked on the door. But it wasn't just Charlie who was sensing it. The air in the room had changed too. It felt colder now, the darkness thicker. The house was awake, and whatever lay beyond the door had noticed the intruder. In the morning, when the door was checked again, the marks were more visible. The scratches had deepened, now carving into the wood as if something had been clawing to get out. It was then that the truth began to sink in. The house was hiding something, and it was ready to reveal itself. The next day passed in a haze, the unease growing with every hour that ticked by. The house, once just old and quiet, now felt alive in a way that made every step, every breath, seem louder than it should have been. The scratching had stopped, but something else had replaced it, an oppressive silence, one that seemed to cling to every corner and fill the spaces in between. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the wind outside felt like a warning. Charlie, who had been so calm in the beginning, now behaved strangely. He refused to go anywhere near the door at the end of the hallway, his eyes darting, nervously whenever he passed it, his body tense with anticipation. His growls were more frequent now, and not just at night, but during the day too. It was as if he knew something was coming. The basement was still off limits, but curiosity had begun to eat away at any sense of caution. It wasn't just the door or the house. It was the feeling that there was something, someone, down there that needed to be discovered. That evening, as the sky began to darken and the air turned colder, something shifted. The house seemed to sigh, almost as if it had waited long enough. When night finally came, the house fell into an unnatural stillness. The lights flickered again, but this time it wasn't just the lights. It was the temperature. A sharp drop in the air, one that felt like a winter wind had swept through the house despite the mild weather outside. The feeling of being watched returned, sharper than before, and every sound felt amplified. The scratching noise from the night before hadn't returned, but something else had. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Soft, muffled, but unmistakably there. They didn't come from the direction of Charlie or the house itself. They came from the basement. It was as if something, someone, was walking, pacing, down there. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an eerie quiet descended over the house. There was no more sound, no more movement, but the air felt charged, like the moments before a storm. Charlie stood by the door to the basement, his body trembling with nervous energy. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if he were waiting for it to open. But no one came. No one moved. The house held its breath, waiting for something. At that moment, a knock came at the front door. Soft, light, almost tentative. The knock was so sudden that it almost seemed out of place, as if the house was trying to divert attention from something far worse. The door remained closed, the knock unanswered. But inside, the presence was palpable. The atmosphere in the house had shifted completely. The warmth, the calm, everything familiar had been drained, replaced with something dark and unknown. A sudden rush of wind blew through the cracked windows, sending a chill through the rooms, and in the distance, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. The basement door. Something had moved inside. It was as if it had been waiting too. Now. The question was no longer if something was in the basement. It was what it wanted, and why it had waited so long to reveal itself. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt as though it was pulsing with a presence, an energy that had taken on a life of its own. The knock on the door earlier, soft as it was, had left a lingering sense of unease that couldn't be shaken off. The strange sounds from the basement had stopped, but it didn't bring any relief. In fact, the stillness that followed was far worse, because with silence came the creeping realization that something was waiting. Charlie, the dog, had been more than just uneasy. His growls had turned into low whines, soft but continuous, as if he was trying to warn someone of a danger that couldn't be seen, only felt. He refused to leave the hallway, his body pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the basement door, as if he could sense something moving just behind it. House itself seemed to grow darker by the minute. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the floors creaked louder with every footstep, and the air thickened. No matter how many times the lights flickered, they always returned to that same dim glow, casting long shadows that made the Yaozai house seem much larger than it really was. The air was unnaturally cold, and every breath seemed to carry a weight to it, as though something unseen was pressing down from above. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling of being trapped, of being pulled into something much older and much darker than anything imaginable. As the hours crawled by, it became impossible to ignore the mounting pressure, the feeling that something was coming closer. Something from within the basement. The house felt alive now, not in the way that homes usually do, with their creaks and groans, but in the way that something ancient and malevolent might. The scratching, the muffled footsteps, they all pointed to the same thing. The basement had always been hiding something that had waited long enough. The door that had been locked tight for so long suddenly seemed to pulse with anticipation. The stroke of midnight, everything went still. The wind outside had stopped, the house quieted, and even the usual sounds of the night seemed to vanish. The only noise now was Charlie's low growl, growing louder as he moved closer to the basement door. It was as if he knew something was about to happen, something that couldn't be avoided. And then, without warning, the basement door creaked open. The sound was so sudden and so jarring that it sent a shock through the air, making every hair on the back of the neck stand up. The door moved slowly, as if something was forcing it open from the other side. The low growls from Charlie turned into frantic barking, his paws scratching at the floor, his body trembling with terror. The dog's eyes were wide, locked on the doorway, as if he could see something approaching that no one else could. But there was nothing there, at least nothing visible. The basement stairs stretched down into an inky blackness, empty and still. The door stayed open, revealing only darkness, but something was watching. Something was waiting, and it was no longer content to stay hidden. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken threat, and the house seemed to be holding its breath. The truth was now undeniable. The basement wasn't just hiding something, it was drawing closer. Whatever was down there had been waiting for the right moment to make itself known, and the moment had come. The air in the house had thickened to an almost unbearable weight, each breath feeling like a struggle against something unseen. The basement door, still ajar, beckoned with a darkness that swallowed everything it touched. Charlie had gone completely still now, his body tense and rigid, as though rooted to the spot. His growls had faded into an unsettling silence, and his eyes, wide and filled with fear, never left the door. Something was down there. That much was certain. But what it was, no one knew. Every instinct told the person watching to turn away, to leave, but there was no escaping this house, not now. No escape from the feeling of being watched, from the pulse of something old and evil that seemed to rise from the very walls. A sudden cold gust of wind blasted through the open door, making the curtains flutter and the lights flicker in their dim state. The stillness of the house seemed to dissolve, replaced by the creeping sound of slow, deliberate footsteps from within the basement. They were faint at first, like a distant echo, but they grew louder. Each step seemed to resonate through the very floorboards beneath, vibrating up through the walls. It was impossible to ignore now. The presence was real, it was here, and it was coming closer. Charlie's body stiffened, his eyes locked on the stairs that led down into the pitch-black abyss below. It felt as though time had stopped, the world outside the house falling away, leaving only the fear that had settled inside the room. The footsteps continued, drawing nearer, until they were almost at the top of the stairs. But no figure emerged from the darkness. The space at the bottom of the stairs remained empty, untouched, as though the air itself was blocking any vision of what lurked down there. The sound of movement stopped abruptly, and the house went eerily quiet once again. Every muscle in the body tensed, every sense straining to catch the smallest hint of what was happening. And then it came. the unmistakable sound of something moving behind the door. The wood groaned as it creaked open wider, as if the house itself was letting something through. The shadow at the foot of the stairs shifted, something moving, crawling, up slowly from the depths below. Charlie bolted forward, barking desperately, but it was too late. The thing that had been hiding in the basement was no longer content to stay hidden. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form twisted, unnaturally long, with limbs that didn't seem to bend right, as though it were something that had crawled straight from a nightmare. It was not quite human, not quite anything that could be described. The eyes, dark, hollow, and endless, locked onto the person, its gaze seeping into the very core, making everything around freeze in terror. The thing stood still, its long arms reaching out from the darkness as if to pull everything it could into its world of torment. And just as quickly, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The house was silent again, but this time the silence was filled with dread. Whatever had been released from the basement had come into the world, and it wasn't finished yet. The silence after the door slammed shut was unbearable. It hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, making it feel as though the very walls of the house were closing in. Charlie, who had once been the fearless protector, was now trembling uncontrollably. His body pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. His growls were gone, replaced by a raw fear that was palpable. The thing from the basement, whatever it was, had not just been released. It was now part of the house, part of the very fabric of the place. No one could deny the presence that now filled every room, every corner. It was as if the house itself had become its prisoner, as though the dark force had taken over everything. The air had turned frigid, colder than anything that could be explained by weather alone. The temperature seemed to drop with every passing second, the chill sinking deep into the bones. The once quiet house was now alive with strange, unsettling noises, scratches, whispers, and the soft padding of footsteps in the dark. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and pulling in ways that made it hard to tell where the darkness ended and the walls began. The presence in the house was no longer a distant threat. It was right there, just beyond the edges of perception. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric, felt like a sign that it was moving, watching, waiting. The basement door remained closed, but that did nothing to erase the feeling that something was lurking just on the other side. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out of the house, but it was too late. The house had already claimed its victim. The doors wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't budge, and even the phone lines had gone dead. No one would be coming. The thing in the basement had locked them in, and now there was nowhere to go. As the hours dragged on, the presence grew more intense, more oppressive. It was as though the walls themselves were pressing in, suffocating the very air. The scratching had returned, louder now, more frantic. It was coming from behind the walls, behind the floors, as though something was trying to claw its way to the surface. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like a struggle against an unseen force. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound, as though the house itself had gone still in anticipation of what would come next. Charlie suddenly stood, his eyes fixed on the basement door once more. His tail was tucked between his legs, his body frozen in place as if caught in a trance. He growled low, the sound vibrating through the room, but it was a growl that was more resigned than angry. It was as though he had accepted something that couldn't be fought. And then, without warning, the door to the basement opened again, slowly, creaking, as if inviting them to come closer, to witness what had been lurking below. But no one dared move. They couldn't. The presence was too strong now, too powerful, and whatever had been released was not done. It wasn't finished. It was only just beginning.